2024 U.S. presidential race is heating up by the second, especially after this image was broadcast across all social media platforms and global media. Former president and leading candidate for the 2024 race, Donald Trump, has returned from the brink of death following an unsuccessful assassination attempt. Now, not just across America, but around the world, Donald Trump is emerging as a courageous warrior figure. His quick reflexes not only saved the life of this powerful man, but also earned him the admiration of people for his fighting spirit. However, Donald Trump is certainly not the only president or former president to have been the target of assassination attempts in the history of this nation. And of course, not everyone has been as lucky as Donald Trump to survive. So, who are these individuals who have walked the thin line between life and death so brutally? Today, let's explore the assassinations in the history of U.S. presidents with the World Explainer, former President Donald Trump. Now we come to the event that is currently shocking the world in July 2024, the failed assassination of Donald Trump. The campaign speech by former President Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania on the evening of July 13th started like many before. Attendees chanted USA as Trump clapped, pointing at faces in the crowd before stepping up to speak. About 430 feet away from the former president, a gunman was climbing onto the roof of a building outside the security perimeter of the campaign event. The individual carried an AR-style rifle. 6 minutes into the former president's speech, the gunman aimed at Trump and pulled the trigger. What happened next is considered a miraculous historic moment. The gunman, later identified by the FBI as 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks, fired multiple shots, one of which Trump said whizzed by his ear. 43 seconds after the first shot was fired, a Secret Service agent reported the gunman had been neutralized. Trump, with one side of his face and ear covered in blood, was helped up. He raised a fist in a defiant and iconic gesture to his supporters to show he was all right before being escorted off the stage and into his SUV. I will not draw any conclusions while there is still much unverified information circulating. Donald Trump is the latest victim of presidential assassination attempts in the U.S. Now let's look back in history to see how these incidents have unfolded. President Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the U.S., was a hero of the American Revolutionary War. A skilled military leader in 1815, he led American forces to victory in the Battle of New Orleans. This earned him significant trust, both politically and among the populace at that time. He became the first Democratic president and was very successful in his political career. On January 30th, 1835, President Andrew Jackson went to the Capitol to attend the funeral of South Carolina Representative Warren R. Davis. The assassin, Richard Lawrence, hid behind a column, waiting for Jackson to exit through the East Gate. The president was just over 2 meters away from the murderer when Lawrence pulled out a concealed gun and aimed it at the president. With such a close distance, the assassin almost couldn't miss. But fortunately, the gun that was cocked did not fire. Realizing he was in danger, President Andrew Jackson immediately reacted in true military fashion. Instead of fleeing, he immediately used his cane and charged at the assassin. To the horror of those around, Lawrence drew a second gun and once again aimed at the president. Miraculously, the gun again failed to fire. A naval officer nearby subdued Lawrence, and the first assassination attempt in U.S. presidential history ended in failure. The government immediately investigated the motive behind the attack and identified the would-be assassin as Richard Lawrence, an English painter. According to reports, Lawrence was delusional. The assassin always thought he was King Richard III of England, who had died over 300 years earlier. At the time of the assassination attempt, He was unemployed and believed the U.S. government owed him a large sum of money, and that killing President Jackson would make the government pay him. After getting the money, he planned to return to England, where he would reclaim his imaginary throne. The trial of the would-be assassin of President Andrew Jackson took place afterward. The jury took only 5 minutes to deliver the final verdict that Lawrence was not guilty due to his insanity. Lawrence spent the remaining 26 years of his life in an insane asylum. However, the government's investigation results did not meet public expectations. Some politicians believed that the cause of the first presidential assassination in the U.S. did not originate from Lawrence, but from Jackson's political opponent, Senator George Poindexter, who had hired Lawrence to repaint his house just a few months before the assassination attempt on Jackson. While President Andrew Jackson was the first to be targeted in an assassination attempt and miraculously survived with a 1 in 125,000 chance when both pistols jammed, President Abraham Lincoln was not so fortunate. A pioneer in the abolition of slavery and a hero of the American Civil War, sadly, he was the first president to die by assassination. On April 14, 1865, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., John Wilkes Booth, an actor and a supporter of the Southern Confederacy, fatally shot President Abraham Lincoln. The attack occurred just 5 days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox, effectively ending the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth came from a family rich in theatrical tradition. An accomplished actor himself, Booth had built a reputation at a renowned theater in Baltimore, Maryland. With his handsome looks and natural acting talent, John was highly compensated and had a large fan base. However, he was deeply discontented with Lincoln's abolition of slavery and humiliated by the South's defeat. To execute his plan, John closely studied the president's schedule on the evening of April 14, 1865. President Lincoln, along with First Lady Mary Todd and 2 other guests, planned to attend a play at Ford's Theater. At the moment of applause, John Booth pulled his gun close to the president's head and fired. After the gunshot, he also slashed at Governor Rathbone, who tried to intervene, then leaped onto the stage shouting, "The tyrant is dead! The South is avenged!" After committing the act, John fled the scene. John Booth was on the run for 12 days before being killed at his hideout in Virginia. The U.S. authorities subsequently arrested and convicted 8 people. 4 were hanged, 3 received life sentences, and 1 was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Although the perpetrators were punished, the loss of Abraham Lincoln was a profound blow to advocates of peace and equality, not just in the United States. After this horrific event, America was shaken again by another successful presidential assassination. President James Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, was one of the shortest-serving presidents with only 200 days in office at the White House before dying from an assassin's bullet. On the morning of July 2, 1881, President Garfield was en route to a college reunion at Williams College. He was traveling by train. At 9:30 a.m., as President Garfield entered the waiting room of Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station No. 6 in Washington, D.C., the assassin, lawyer Charles J. Guiteau, approached and fired from behind. Guiteau fired repeatedly, causing President Garfield to fall. One bullet grazed the president's shoulder, and another entered his back, passing through the first lumbar vertebra but missing the spinal cord and lodging behind the pancreas. Guiteau slipped the revolver into his pocket and attempted to escape in a cab waiting outside the station, but was quickly subdued and arrested by police. President Garfield was severely wounded but did not die immediately. The best doctors of the time were summoned to remove the bullets. However, due to prolonged treatment, the wounds became severely infected, causing unbearable pain throughout the summer, and he eventually died on September 14, 1881. Guiteau's trial took place in November of that year. During the trial, Guiteau garnered media attention for his erratic behavior. He claimed innocence, arguing that the shooting was God's will, and he was merely an instrument. He also argued that President Garfield died due to the incompetence of his doctors. "I admit to the shooting, but not the murder, if you respect the honor," he stated. If you've been following from the beginning of this video, you may notice that presidential assassinations occurred quite frequently within a short span. If we include the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, 3 such incidents happened in less than 40 years, all targeting U.S. presidents. This raised significant concerns about the security of American presidents. On September 5, 1901, the 25th U.S. President, William McKinley, delivered a speech at the Pan American Exposition, an event similar to today's World Expo, held in Buffalo, New York. Over 100,000 people attended the president's speech, fresh from leading the country to victory in the Spanish-American War. The next day, McKinley returned to the exposition to watch a theatrical performance and participate in a public meet and greet, despite his staff's concerns about potential dangers. Those fears became reality. Among those in line to meet President McKinley was Leon Czolgosz, a 28-year-old unemployed Polish immigrant from Detroit who blamed the authorities for his troubles. Days before, Czolgosz had traveled to Buffalo, purchased a revolver, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and hidden it in his coat pocket. At 4 p.m. that day, Czolgosz was at the front of the line, and as McKinley extended his hand to greet him, Czolgosz pulled out the gun and shot the president twice. As McKinley staggered backward, a man named James Parker emerged from the crowd of McKinley fans and knocked Czolgosz down with a punch to the face. President McKinley was taken to a temporary hospital at the exposition and underwent emergency surgery. But after a brief recovery, his condition worsened and he died on September 14, 1901. The 3 assassinations in a short period underscored the need for a formally trained and dedicated security force to protect the U.S. president, leading to the establishment of the United States Secret Service as we know it today. Despite the establishment of the U.S. Secret Service being seen as a strong move to counter presidential assassinations, just over a decade after McKinley's death, President Theodore Roosevelt faced a bold assassination attempt. The assassination attempt occurred around 8 p.m. on October 14, 1912. Then President Theodore Roosevelt stepped into a car parked outside the Gilpatrick Hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. While standing in the convertible, Roosevelt waved his hat to greet the crowd. Suddenly, a flash of light from a handgun at about 1.5 meters away was followed by the sound of gunfire. A companion of Roosevelt tackled the gunman to prevent a second shot. After the gunman was subdued, the crowd supporting the president shouted in anger, "Kill him!" According to witnesses, the calmest person at that moment was the shooting victim, Roosevelt. This was when people noticed something unusual. President Theodore Roosevelt seemed unharmed by the bullet. He reached inside his coat and felt a coin-sized bullet hole on the right side of his chest. "That fellow pinked me," Roosevelt told an official from his party. The president coughed into his hand 3 times, saw no blood, and despite his doctors urging to go straight to the hospital, he decided to proceed to his scheduled speech. Standing before an attentive crowd, President Theodore Roosevelt then pulled out a prepared speech manuscript from his breast pocket, which had been pierced by the bullet. Not only the manuscript, but also a steel eyeglass case in his pocket had saved his life. The crowd was even more shocked when he unbuttoned his vest to reveal a blood-stained shirt. Clearly, Roosevelt turned an adverse event to his advantage. Those present at the speech from that moment on listened intently to the president and admired him as a hero for his insistence on not stopping the speech. Over a century later, things seemed to repeat with Donald Trump as we had seen. The tragic story of JFK is perhaps the most famous incumbent presidential assassination in history. The horrific event was captured live on television, deeply imprinting the young, beloved president into the minds of millions. On November 21, 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy, along with First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, embarked on a 2-day fundraising journey to 5 cities in Texas. The trip was also an effort to bridge the divisions within the Democratic Party in a crucial state for Kennedy's 1964 re-election prospects. On the morning of November 22nd, after delivering a speech at a parking lot outside his hotel, President Kennedy and his entourage took a short flight to Dallas's Love Field. At the airport, the President and First Lady shook hands with a welcoming crowd before getting into the back of an open-top car with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife to proceed to the Trade Mart, the next stop on the trip where another speech was scheduled. Approximately 200,000 people lined the 10-mile route to the Trade Mart to see the president. At around 12:30 p.m., the motorcade turned southwest on Elm Street and began passing through Dealey Plaza on the outskirts of downtown Dallas. As the open-top car carrying President Kennedy passed the Texas School Book Depository building, several gunshots rang out. A bullet struck President Kennedy in the neck, hit Governor Connally sitting in front of him, and another bullet struck Kennedy in the head. The motorcade rushed to the nearby Parkland Memorial Hospital, but efforts to save him were in vain. President Kennedy was declared dead at 1 p.m. An hour later, as America and the world were still reeling from Kennedy's death, the manhunt for the assassin began. Soon after, the perpetrator was caught and identified as former Marine Lee Harvey Oswald. However, the trial never occurred as Oswald was fatally shot 2 days later by a local nightclub owner seeking vengeance for the president, claiming he didn't want to see the First Lady testify in court about the horrifying event. Thus, the motive for the crime remains a mystery to this day. The assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan occurred on March 30th, 1981, just 69 days after he took office as President of the United States. The event took place outside the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., right after Reagan delivered a speech. At 2:30 p.m. on March 30th, 1981, after finishing his speech at a conference at the Washington Hilton, President Reagan left the hotel for his waiting limousine. A loud shout from the media crowd, "President Reagan!" made him turn back and wave. Suddenly, a man pulled out a gun and fired 6 shots at the president. The assassin was John Hinckley Jr., a 25-year-old with mental health issues. Obsessed with actress Jodie Foster, Hinckley devised the assassination attempt to impress her. He fired 6 shots from a .22 caliber handgun as Reagan was leaving the hotel. Reagan was quickly transported to George Washington University Hospital, where surgeons performed emergency surgery to remove the bullet. He recovered remarkably and returned to work just a few weeks later. John Hinckley Jr. was tried and found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to a mental institution for many years. In 2016, Hinckley was released under supervision after doctors concluded he no longer posed a threat to society. The assassination attempt sparked a heated debate over gun control and mental health issues in the United States. Clearly, firearms remain a significant issue in America as too many people have access to these dangerous weapons. And this issue has threatened, is threatening, and will likely continue to threaten many lives in this country, including those of its presidents. Yet, for all 4 presidents who have faced death, it was an opportunity for them to rise and leave an indelible mark on history, like this iconic image of Donald Trump. What do you think about this issue? Let's discuss it in the comments below. For now, goodbye and see you again.